In the shadow of broken walls and shattered dreams, a nation struggled to find its way home, not just geographically, but spiritually. The year was approximately 458 BCE, and the children of Israel had returned from their 70-year exile in Babylon. Yet returning to a land and truly coming home are two entirely different things. Jerusalem lay in ruins. The once magnificent Temple of Solomon was nothing more than rubble and memory. The walls that had once protected the holy city were broken down, leaving gaps like missing teeth in an ancient smile. Houses stood empty, their roofs caved in their doorways, dark. The few families that had managed to return from Babylon lived scattered across the countryside, trying to scratch out a living from soil that had been neglected for generations. But the physical devastation was nothing compared to the spiritual wasteland that had taken root in the hearts of the people. They had forgotten the law of Moses. The traditions that had once bound them together as God's chosen people had been diluted, corrupted, or abandoned entirely. Marriages with pagan neighbors had introduced foreign gods and foreign ways. The priesthood was in disarray. The temple services had ceased. Even the Hebrew language itself was being forgotten, as Aramaic, the language of their captors, became the tongue of daily conversation. This was not the glorious return that the prophets had promised. This was not the restoration that their fathers had dreamed of during those long, bitter years by the rivers of Babylon. Instead of triumph, there was confusion. Instead of celebration, there was silence. The people went through the motions of daily life, but their hearts were empty, their souls hungry for something they could barely remember. Into this broken world, God was preparing to send a man. Not a king, though he would lead with royal authority. Not a prophet, though his words would carry the power of divine revelation. Not a warrior, though he would fight battles that would determine the destiny of nations. God was preparing to send a scribe, a teacher, a man whose weapon would be the word of God, and whose battlefield would be the human heart. His name was Ezra, and he was about to change everything. But before we meet this remarkable man, we must understand the world he would enter. We must feel the weight of the despair that pressed down on every family, every community, every heart in that desolate land. We must see the spiritual hunger in the eyes of children who had never heard the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We must sense the confusion of parents who wanted to teach their children about the God of Israel, but could barely remember the words themselves. The return from exile had begun decades earlier under Zerubbabel, but it had been a return of bodies, not hearts. The people had come back to the land, but they had not come back to their God. They had rebuilt some houses, planted some crops, even begun the slow process of reconstructing the temple. But they had not rebuilt their relationship with the Almighty. They had not restored the covenant that had once made them the light of the world. In the midst of this spiritual poverty, families struggled with questions that had no easy answers. How do you worship a God whose temple lies in ruins? How do you follow laws you can barely remember? How do you maintain your identity as God's people when everyone around you worships different gods, follows different customs, speaks different languages? Some had given up entirely assimilating into the pagan cultures around them. Others clung desperately to fragments of memory, trying to piece together a faith from half-remembered stories and dimly understood traditions. Still others waited, praying that somehow, some way God would remember his promises and send them the help they so desperately needed. The economic situation was as bleak as the spiritual one. The land that had once flowed with milk and honey now yielded barely enough to sustain life. The trade routes that had once brought prosperity to Jerusalem were controlled by hostile neighbors. The craftsmen and merchants who had once made Israel wealthy were scattered across the Persian Empire, many choosing to remain in Babylon where life was more comfortable and opportunities more plentiful. Those who had returned found themselves at the mercy of local governors who cared nothing for their history or their God. Taxes were high, justice was scarce, and the future looked uncertain. Young people saw no reason to stay in this struggling land when the great cities of the empire offered education, careers, and comfort. The population was aging, diminishing, losing hope with each passing year. Yet in this darkness there were still those who remembered. Old priests who had learned the ancient songs from their fathers, elderly women who could still recite the stories of Moses and David, scattered families who had somehow managed to preserve scrolls of the law hidden away and protected through all the long years of exile. These flickering flames of faith were all that remained of what had once been a blazing fire that lit the world. And in Babylon, in the great libraries and schools of the most powerful empire on earth, one man was preparing to fan those flames back to life. Ezra ben Sariah was not an impressive figure by the standards of his time. He held no political office commanded, no armies owned, no great estates. He was a scribe, a scholar, a man who spent his days bent over ancient texts, copying and studying and memorizing the words that most of his contemporaries had forgotten. But in the divine economy, this quiet scholar was about to become one of the most important leaders in Israel's history. He was a descendant of Aaron, the first high priest, which gave him both the right and the responsibility to serve in the temple. But more than his bloodline, it was his character that set him apart. While other Jews in Babylon had grown comfortable with their exile, building successful businesses and prestigious careers, Ezra's heart remained in Jerusalem. While others had gradually adopted Persian customs and Persian gods, Ezra had devoted himself to studying and preserving the law of Moses. Day after day, year after year, he had immersed himself in the sacred writings. He had memorized vast portions of the Torah. He had studied the Psalms of David until he could recite them in his sleep. He had pored over the prophecies, tracing God's promises through the centuries, watching for signs that the time of restoration was at hand. But Ezra was not just a scholar. He was a man of prayer. He understood that knowledge without wisdom is useless, that wisdom without power is ineffective, and that power without divine blessing is dangerous. He had learned to seek God's face in everything, to submit every plan to divine scrutiny, to wait for the Lord's timing, rather than rushing ahead with human schemes. This combination of scholarship and spirituality, of learning and humility, of knowledge and faith, had caught the attention of heaven. God was looking for a man who could bridge the gap between the past and the present, who could take the ancient truths and make them relevant to a new generation. He was looking for someone who understood both the letter of the law and the heart of the lawgiver. He was looking for Ezra. The call came in a way that was both surprising and perfectly natural. King Artaxerxes of Persia, the most powerful man on earth, issued a decree that would change the course of history. But it was not really the king's decree. It was God working through earthly authority to accomplish his purposes. The king who worshipped Persian gods and knew nothing of Israel's history found himself compelled to issue orders that would restore the Jewish people to their land and their law. The decree was remarkable in its scope and generosity. Ezra was authorized to take with him anyone who wanted to return to Jerusalem. He was given access to the royal treasury to fund the restoration of the temple. He was granted authority to appoint judges and governors to enforce Jewish law, even to impose penalties on those who refused to comply. It was as if God had opened the windows of heaven and poured out blessing in a way that no one could have imagined. But with great privilege came great responsibility. Ezra understood that this was not an opportunity for personal advancement, but a divine commission to restore God's people to God's ways. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. How could one man, even with royal backing, undo decades of spiritual decline? How could he convince a scattered, demoralized people to embrace a law they had forgotten and a God they barely remembered? The answer, he knew, lay not in his own abilities, but in the power of God's Word. If the people could be brought face to face with the truth of Scripture, if they could hear and understand the law of Moses, if they could remember who they were and whose they were, then transformation would be possible. It would not be easy, but it would be possible. And so Ezra began to prepare. He gathered around him a team of priests and Levites men who shared his vision for spiritual restoration. He recruited teachers and scribes who could help interpret the law for people who had forgotten how to read Hebrew. He organized the practical aspects of the journey, supplies, transportation, protection for the long and dangerous trip from Babylon to Jerusalem. But most importantly, he prepared himself. He spent long hours in prayer, seeking God's guidance for the challenges ahead. He fasted and meditated, allowing the Word of God to saturate his soul until it flowed out in every word he spoke and every decision he made. He studied the history of Israel's previous failures and successes, learning from the mistakes of the past and drawing strength from God's faithfulness through the centuries. As the day of departure approached, Ezra felt the full weight of what lay ahead. He was leaving behind the comfort and security of Babylon for the uncertainty and hardship of Jerusalem. He was abandoning a life of quiet scholarship for the tumultuous world of leadership and politics. He was trading the company of fellow scholars for the challenge of teaching people who might not want to learn. Yet his heart was filled with anticipation rather than dread. This was what he had been born for, what God had been preparing him for all his life. Every hour spent studying the law, every day spent in prayer, every year spent waiting for God's timing had been leading to this moment. He was about to embark on the greatest adventure of faith imaginable, the restoration of a nation's relationship with God. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem was more than a physical relocation. It was a pilgrimage, a return to the heart of everything that mattered. And as Ezra looked back one last time at the great city that had been his home, he knew there was no turning back. God had called, and he would answer. God had commanded, and he would obey. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited, whatever opposition he might face, he was ready. The restoration was about to begin. The morning of departure dawned clear and bright, as if heaven itself was blessing the journey. Ezra stood before the assembled company of returnees, nearly 5,000 souls, who had chosen to leave the comfort and security of Babylon for the uncertainty of rebuilding in Jerusalem. They came from every walk of life, priests and Levites who longed to serve in the temple, craftsmen eager to ply their trades in the rebuilding effort, merchants seeking new opportunities, and families simply following the call of God on their hearts. But as Ezra looked out over the crowd, he felt a moment of profound humility. Here were people who were trusting him to lead them safely across nearly 1,000 miles of desert, mountain, and river. Here were families who had sold their possessions, said goodbye to friends, and committed their futures to his vision of spiritual restoration. The weight of that trust was almost overwhelming. In his hand, Ezra held the decree from King Artaxerxes, a document that represented more than royal authorization. It was evidence of God's providential care, proof that the Almighty could move the hearts of earthly kings to accomplish divine purposes. The decree granted him authority that no Jewish leader had possessed since the days of the monarchy. He could appoint judges, establish courts, enforce the law of Moses, with the full backing of the Persian Empire. Yet Ezra knew that all the royal authority in the world would be useless without the blessing of God. And so, before they set out on their journey, he called the entire company to join him in a solemn act of consecration. They fasted and prayed, acknowledging their dependence on divine protection and guidance. They confessed their sins and renewed their commitment to following God's law. They dedicated themselves and their mission to the glory of the Almighty. The decree itself was remarkable in its scope and detail. The king had not only authorized the journey, but had provided funding from the royal treasury. Gold and silver vessels for the temple offerings, for the sacrificial system, provisions for the journey, and ongoing financial support for the restored worship in Jerusalem. It was as if Cyrus's original decree allowing the Jews to return had been expanded and amplified, providing resources that the earlier returnees could never have imagined. But even more significant than the material provisions was the spiritual authority that the decree represented. Ezra was commissioned not just to return to Jerusalem, but to restore the law of Moses as the governing principle of Jewish life. He was authorized to teach the law to those who did not know it and to enforce it upon those who refused to obey it. In effect, he was being given the authority to reconstitute Israel as a theocracy, a nation governed by God's law rather than human whim. This authority came with enormous responsibility. Ezra understood that he was not being called to impose his own ideas or preferences upon the people. He was being called to be faithful to the Word of God, to teach and apply the law of Moses with wisdom and justice and compassion. The success or failure of the entire restoration effort would depend on how faithfully he carried out this sacred trust. As they prepared to leave, Ezra made a decision that revealed both his faith and his wisdom. Despite the dangers of the journey and the valuable cargo they carried, he chose not to request a military escort from the king. He had already testified to the king about God's protection over those who trust in him, and he could not now act as if he doubted that protection. Instead, he placed his complete confidence in the God of Israel to guard and guide them on their way. This decision was not made lightly. The route from Babylon to Jerusalem passed through territories controlled by hostile tribes and bandits, who would see a large company of travelers with valuable possessions as an irresistible target. There were rivers to cross, deserts to traverse, and mountain passes to navigate. Wild animals, severe weather, and human enemies all posed real threats to the success of their mission. But Ezra had learned through years of study and prayer that faith is not the absence of danger, but the presence of God in the midst of danger. He had read the stories of Abraham leaving Ur, of Moses leading Israel through the wilderness, of Joshua conquering the promised land. He knew that God's greatest works are often accomplished when his people have no choice but to depend completely on his power and provision. The company that gathered around Ezra was a microcosm of Israel itself. There were descendants of the priestly line of Aaron, eager to restore the proper worship in the temple. There were Levites who would serve as assistants in the religious ceremonies and as teachers of the law throughout the land. There were laymen from every tribe bringing their various skills and crafts to contribute to the rebuilding effort. Among them were entire families, fathers and mothers with small children, elderly grandparents who had never given up hope of seeing Jerusalem again, young adults who had grown up hearing stories of the homeland they had never seen. There were the wealthy who brought substantial resources to support the mission, and the poor who brought only their willingness to work and their faith in God's promises. Each person had their own story, their own reason for making this momentous decision. Some were motivated by religious conviction, longing to worship in the temple and live under God's law. Others were drawn by economic opportunity, hoping to establish themselves in the rebuilding of the ancient homeland. Still others came simply because they trusted Ezra's leadership and wanted to be part of whatever God was doing through him. But regardless of their individual motivations, they were united by a common hope that God was indeed restoring his people and that they were privileged to be part of that restoration. They were leaving behind the familiar for the unknown, the comfortable for the challenging, the safe for the risky. It was an act of faith that would be remembered for generations. As they set out from Babylon, Ezra led them in singing the Psalms of Ascent, the songs that pilgrims had sung for centuries, as they made their way to Jerusalem for the great festivals. These ancient melodies carried new meaning now as they became not just songs of pilgrimage, but songs of permanent return, not just hymns of worship, but anthems of restoration. The journey ahead would take approximately 4 months, covering nearly 1,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain in the ancient world. They would follow the great trade routes north from Babylon, then west along the Euphrates River, then south through Syria and into the land of Israel. It was the same route that Abraham had traveled centuries earlier when God called him to leave Ur and journey to the Promised Land. But this journey was more than a physical relocation. It was a spiritual pilgrimage. With every mile they traveled, they were moving closer, not just to their ancestral homeland, but to their covenant relationship with God. They were retracing the steps of their forefathers, following in the footsteps of those who had first heard the call to be God's chosen people. And leading them was a man who understood that his role was not just to get them safely to Jerusalem, but to prepare them spiritually for the work of restoration that awaited them there. Every day of the journey would be an opportunity to teach, to encourage, to strengthen their faith and resolve. Every challenge they faced together would bind them more closely as a community committed to God's purposes. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but their destination was sure. God had promised to restore His people to His land, and God's promises never fail. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, whatever difficulties they might encounter, they were moving forward in the confidence that the same God who had called them out of Babylon would bring them safely to Jerusalem and empower them to accomplish His will there. The restoration had begun, and there was no turning back. The ancient trade route stretched out before them like a ribbon across the harsh landscape connecting the great civilizations of Mesopotamia with the lands of the West. For countless generations, merchants and armies, diplomats and pilgrims had traveled this road carrying goods and ideas, dreams and destinies across the vast expanse of the Persian Empire. Now, it would carry something even more precious, the hopes of a nation returning home. Ezra walked near the front of the long caravan, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of danger or difficulty. The responsibility he felt for every life under his care was almost overwhelming. These were not just fellow travelers, they were covenant partners in the most important mission of his lifetime. Their safety, their spiritual welfare, their ultimate success in Jerusalem all rested heavily on his shoulders. The first days of travel were marked by a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The excitement came from the realization that they were actually doing it. They were leaving Babylon behind and heading toward the land of their ancestors. Children who had never seen anything but the flat plains of Mesopotamia gazed in wonder at the changing landscape. Adults who had only dreamed of this moment found themselves actually walking the roads their forefathers had walked. But along with excitement came apprehension. The dangers of ancient travel were very real. Bandits preyed on caravans, especially those known to be carrying valuable cargo. Wild animals roamed the wilderness areas between settled regions. Weather could turn deadly without warning. Rivers could become impassable due to flood or drought. Disease could sweep through a traveling company with devastating speed. Moreover, this was not just any caravan. They were Jews returning to Jerusalem with royal permission and royal funding. Their very existence was a political statement that might be viewed with hostility by local populations who had grown accustomed to Jewish absence from their ancestral homeland. They were carrying gold and silver vessels intended for the temple, making them an attractive target for robbery. They were traveling as a religious community, which might provoke opposition from those who worship different gods. Yet as Ezra looked back along the length of the caravan, he felt his heart fill with confidence. Not confidence in their own strength or wisdom, but confidence in the God who had called them to this journey. The same God who had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, who had led them through the wilderness, who had brought them into the promised land, who had preserved them through decades of exile, was now leading them home again. Each evening as they made camp in the growing darkness, Ezra would gather the people together for prayer and instruction. These were not just practical meetings to discuss the next day's travel plans. They were spiritual assemblies designed to keep their hearts focused on the purpose of their journey. They were not just traveling to Jerusalem, they were traveling toward renewed obedience to God's law. Night after night, by the flickering light of campfires, Ezra would open the scrolls of the law and read to the assembled company. Many of them had never heard these words before, at least not in their original Hebrew. Others had heard fragments and portions, but never the complete systematic presentation of God's will for His people. As Ezra read and explained, as he connected the ancient words to their present situation, something beautiful began to happen. The people began to remember who they were. They were not just refugees returning to a ruined city. They were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the people to whom God had given the law at Mount Sinai. They were the nation chosen to be a light to the Gentiles, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation set apart for God's purposes. They were the inheritors of promises that stretched back through the centuries and forward into eternity. As this identity began to take root in their hearts, the hardships of travel became more bearable. The long days of walking under the scorching sun became acts of pilgrimage rather than mere endurance. The challenges of crossing rivers and navigating mountain passes became opportunities to trust in God's provision rather than simply obstacles to overcome. One particularly difficult stretch of the journey took them through a region known for its harsh terrain and hostile inhabitants. The road wound through rocky passes where ambush was easy and escape was difficult. Water sources were scarce, and the few wells they encountered were often guarded by armed men who demanded payment for access. It was here that Ezra's decision not to request military escort from the king proved its wisdom. A large military force would have been seen as a threat by the local tribes, possibly provoking the very attacks they sought to avoid. Instead, their obviously peaceful intentions, combined with their willingness to pay fair prices for supplies and passage, helped them navigate these dangerous territories without serious incident. But more than human wisdom was at work. Time and again they experienced what could only be described as divine protection. Storms that threatened to wash away their camps would suddenly shift direction. Wild animals that should have been dangerous showed unusual timidity. Hostile tribes that had attacked other caravans allowed them to pass unmolested. These experiences strengthened their faith and deepened their sense of being part of God's unfolding plan. They were not just lucky travelers, they were a people under divine protection, carrying out a sacred mission. Every day that passed without serious incident was a reminder that the God of their fathers was still watching over His chosen people. The landscape itself seemed to tell the story of their history. As they moved west from Babylon, they passed the ruins of ancient cities that had once been centers of power and culture. Here was a reminder of the rise and fall of human kingdoms. There was evidence of the temporary nature of earthly glory. But they were traveling towards something that would endure, the eternal city, the place where God had chosen to put His name, the center of His covenant relationship with His people. Rivers that had to be crossed reminded them of the Jordan which their ancestors had crossed to enter the Promised Land. Mountains that had to be climbed reminded them of Sinai, where Moses had received the law. Deserts that had to be traversed reminded them of the wilderness wanderings when God had provided manna from heaven and water from the rock. Every geographical feature became a sermon, every landmark a lesson in faith. Ezra used these natural teaching moments to great effect, helping the people see their journey not just as a physical relocation, but as a spiritual pilgrimage that connected them with the great themes of their history. As they traveled, word of their mission began to spread along the trade routes. Other Jewish communities, scattered throughout the Persian Empire, sent messengers to wish them well and to offer whatever assistance they could provide. Some even decided to join the caravan, swelling their numbers and adding to the sense that this was indeed a movement of God rather than merely a human enterprise. But they also encountered those who viewed their mission with suspicion or hostility. Provincial governors who had grown comfortable with Jewish absence from Jerusalem were concerned about the implications of their return. Local populations who had moved into formerly Jewish territories worried about losing land or privilege. Religious leaders of other faiths saw the restoration of Jewish worship as a potential threat to their own influence. These encounters provided opportunities for Ezra to demonstrate both wisdom and courage. He was always respectful toward legitimate authority, careful to show his royal authorization and to explain that their mission had the full backing of the Persian king. But he was also firm in his commitment to their divine calling, refusing to be intimidated or deterred by threats or opposition. Through it all, the caravan pressed forward with remarkable unity and determination. The shared hardships of travel, the common dangers they faced, and the inspiring leadership Ezra provided all served to bind them together as a community of faith. By the time they reached the borders of Judah, they were no longer just a collection of individuals and families who happened to be traveling together. They had become a people united in purpose and committed to the work of restoration that lay ahead. As the familiar hills of Jerusalem finally came into view, a great shout went up from the entire company. Children who had never seen the holy city pointed and laughed with excitement. Adults who had left Jerusalem as children wept with joy at the sight of home. Elderly pilgrims who had despaired of ever seeing this day praised God with voices cracked by age and emotion. But for Ezra, the moment was bittersweet. Yes, they had arrived safely, and yes, their mission could now begin in earnest. But he could also see the reality of what awaited them. The walls were still broken, the temple was still incomplete, the city was still largely in ruins. The work ahead would be even more challenging than the journey behind. Yet, as he looked out over the face of his fellow travelers, as he saw the hope and determination in their eyes, as he felt the weight of God's calling on his heart, Ezra knew that they were ready for whatever lay ahead. They had been tested on the journey and had not been found wanting. They had been prepared by hardship and sustained by faith. They had been transformed from exiles into pilgrims, from refugees into restorers. The journey was over, but the real work was just beginning. The first sight of Jerusalem was both heartbreaking and inspiring. From a distance, the ancient city still possessed a certain majesty, its walls and towers silhouetted against the Judean hills like a crown upon the head of creation. But as their caravan drew closer, the harsh reality of decades of neglect and destruction became painfully apparent. Where once proud gates had welcomed pilgrims from every nation, now gaping holes in the wall stood like missing teeth in an ancient skull. The stones that had tumbled down during the Babylonian siege still lay scattered in chaotic piles, overgrown with weeds and serving as shelter for wild animals. What buildings remained intact were weathered and worn, their roofs partially collapsed, their walls cracked and crumbling. Ezra's heart ached as he surveyed the scene. This was the city of David, the place where Solomon had built the magnificent temple, the center of worship for countless generations of faithful Israelites. This was the city about which the psalmist had written, "Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king." But now it looked more like a graveyard than a great city, more like a monument to defeat than a symbol of divine favor. The people already living in and around Jerusalem watched their approach with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some were Jews who had never been taken into exile, families that had somehow survived the destruction and maintained a precarious existence in the ruined city. Others were foreigners who had been settled in the land by various Persian administrators, people who had grown comfortable in the absence of any strong Jewish presence. The returning exiles represented a significant change in the regional balance of power. They came with royal authorization, substantial financial resources, and clear intentions to restore not just the city, but the ancient Jewish way of life. This would inevitably affect trade relationships, land ownership, political arrangements, and religious practices throughout the area. But Ezra's immediate concern was not politics, but practical necessity. Nearly 5,000 people needed food, water, and shelter. The journey had been long and exhausting, and many were sick or weak from the rigors of travel. Children needed medical attention. Elderly travelers required rest, and everyone needed time to recover before the serious work of restoration could begin. The first few days in Jerusalem were organized chaos. Temporary camps sprang up outside the city walls as families searched for relatives who had arrived in earlier groups of returnees. Merchants in the caravan began negotiating with local traders for supplies and materials. Craftsmen surveyed the ruins, making preliminary assessments of what could be salvaged and what would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Through it all, Ezra moved among the people like a shepherd among his flock, offering encouragement, settling disputes, and maintaining focus on their ultimate purpose. He had not brought them this far simply to reestablish a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. He had brought them to restore the covenant relationship between God and His people, and everything else was secondary to that primary mission. After ensuring that the immediate physical needs of his company were met, Ezra began his systematic survey of the city and its surroundings. What he found was both worse and better than he had expected. Worse because the level of destruction was even more complete than reports had suggested. Better because there were still people in the land who remembered the old ways, who had preserved fragments of the law, who were eager for the kind of spiritual leadership he had come to provide. The temple area was particularly heartbreaking. The foundation of the new temple had been laid decades earlier, and some progress had been made on the walls. But work had stalled repeatedly due to opposition from neighboring peoples and lack of resources. What stood now was a sad shadow of Solomon's magnificent structure, more a reminder of former glory than a symbol of present hope. Yet, As Ezra walked through the partially completed temple courts, he could envision what it would become. Not perhaps as physically magnificent as Solomon's temple, but equally sacred in God's sight. A place where the ancient sacrifices could be resumed, where the festivals could be celebrated, where the people could come to worship the God of their fathers in spirit and in truth. The human situation was even more complex than the physical one. The Jews who had remained in the land during the exile had adapted in various ways to their circumstances. Some had maintained their Jewish identity as best they could, preserving what traditions they remembered and passing them on to their children. Others had intermarried with the surrounding peoples, creating families and communities that were ethnically and religiously mixed. Still others had largely abandoned their Jewish heritage, adopting the customs and gods of their neighbors. These different groups viewed the returning exiles with different emotions. Those who had remained faithful to their Jewish identity welcomed them as brothers and sisters, eager to learn from their superior knowledge of the law and to participate in the restoration of proper worship. Those who had compromised their faith felt threatened and defensive, worried that their lifestyle choices would be challenged or condemned. Those who had abandoned Judaism altogether saw the returnees as unwelcome intruders who might disrupt the comfortable arrangements they had made with their non-Jewish neighbors. Ezra understood that these tensions would need to be addressed with great wisdom and sensitivity. He could not simply impose his will upon people who had their own history, their own struggles, their own reasons for the choices they had made during the long years of exile. Yet neither could he compromise on the essential requirement that God's people live according to God's law. The restoration would require both grace and truth, both compassion and conviction. His first public act was to gather all the people in the square before the water gate and to read to them from the law of Moses. This was not a random selection of interesting passages, but a systematic presentation of God's covenant requirements. For many in the crowd, it was the first time they had heard the complete law read in Hebrew with proper interpretation and explanation. The response was immediate and powerful. As the words of the law penetrated hearts that had been hungry for spiritual truth, people began to weep. Some wept with joy at finally understanding their identity and purpose as God's people. Others wept with sorrow as they realized how far they had strayed from God's requirements. Still others wept with fear as they grasped the magnitude of the changes that would be required to bring their lives into conformity with divine standards. But Ezra did not allow the assembly to end in despair. After reading the law, he explained its purpose and meaning. The law was not given to condemn, but to guide, not to destroy, but to build up, not to separate God's people from their Creator, but to draw them closer to Him. Yes, they had failed to keep the law perfectly. Yes, they would need to make significant changes in their lives. But God was gracious and merciful, ready to forgive those who truly repented and committed themselves to obedience. The reading of the law became a regular occurrence, not just a one-time event. Day after day, week after week, Ezra would gather the people and open the scrolls. Gradually, systematically, he worked through the entire Torah, explaining each section, answering questions, helping the people understand how the ancient words applied to their present circumstances. As the law took root in their hearts and minds, changes began to occur throughout the community. Families that had been practicing pagan customs began to eliminate idols from their homes. Business practices that had been influenced by Persian and Babylonian ethics were adjusted to conform to biblical standards. Social relationships that had developed during the exile were examined in light of covenant requirements. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Some families had developed strong emotional and economic ties with their non-Jewish neighbors and were reluctant to alter relationships that had served them well during difficult times. Some individuals had adopted practices or beliefs that were more comfortable or convenient than traditional Jewish ways and resented being told to change. But the majority of the people responded with enthusiasm and commitment. They had returned to Jerusalem not just to escape the problems of exile, but to rediscover their identity as God's covenant people. They wanted to live in a way that honored their heritage and pleased their Creator. They were willing to make the necessary adjustments even when those adjustments were difficult or costly. The physical reconstruction of Jerusalem proceeded alongside its spiritual restoration. Work crews repaired the walls, rebuilt houses, cleared rubble from the streets, and restored basic infrastructure. The temple construction resumed with new energy and purpose as people began to understand that they were not just building a structure, but creating a place where heaven and earth could meet, where the presence of God could dwell among His people. But Ezra understood that buildings and walls, no matter how well constructed, could not guarantee the success of the restoration. The real work was happening in human hearts as individuals and families rediscovered what it meant to live as covenant people in covenant relationship with the covenant God. The transformation was remarkable, but it was not complete. There were still challenges to face, still problems to solve, still opposition to overcome. The restoration of Jerusalem would require not just initial enthusiasm, but sustained commitment, not just good intentions, but practical wisdom, not just human effort, but divine blessing. And as Ezra looked out over the city that was slowly coming back to life, as he watched families learning to live according to God's, in the shadow of broken walls and shattered dreams, a nation struggled to find its way home, not just geographically, but spiritually. The year was approximately 458 BCE, and the children of Israel had returned from their 70-year exile in Babylon. Yet returning to a land and truly coming home are two entirely different things. Jerusalem lay in ruins. The once magnificent Temple of Solomon was nothing more than rubble and memory. The walls that had once protected the holy city were broken down, leaving gaps like missing teeth in an ancient smile. Houses stood empty, their roofs caved in their doorways, dark. The few families that had managed to return from Babylon lived scattered across the countryside, trying to scratch out a living from soil that had been neglected for generations. But the physical devastation was nothing compared to the spiritual wasteland that had taken root in the hearts of the people. They had forgotten the law of Moses. The traditions that had once bound them together as God's chosen people had been diluted, corrupted, or abandoned entirely. Marriages with pagan neighbors had introduced foreign gods and foreign ways. The priesthood was in disarray. The temple services had ceased. Even the Hebrew language itself was being forgotten as Aramaic, the language of their captors, became the tongue of daily conversation. This was not the glorious return that the prophets had promised. This was not the restoration that their fathers had dreamed of during those long, bitter years by the rivers of Babylon. Instead of triumph, there was confusion. Instead of celebration, there was silence. The people went through the motions of daily life, but their hearts were empty, their souls hungry for something they could barely remember. Into this broken world, God was preparing to send a man, not a king, though he would lead with royal authority, not a prophet, though his words would carry the power of divine revelation, not a warrior, though he would fight battles that would determine the destiny of nations. God was preparing to send a scribe, a teacher, a man whose weapon would be the Word of God and whose battlefield would be the human heart. His name was Ezra, and he was about to change everything. But before we meet this remarkable man, we must understand the world he would enter. We must feel the weight of the despair that pressed down on every family, every community, every heart in that desolate land. We must see the spiritual hunger in the eyes of children who had never heard the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We must sense the confusion of parents who wanted to teach their children about the God of Israel, but could barely remember the words themselves. The return from exile had begun decades earlier under Zerubbabel, but it had been a return of bodies, not hearts. The people had come back to the land, but they had not come back to their God. They had rebuilt some houses, planted some crops, even begun the slow process of reconstructing the temple. But they had not rebuilt their relationship with the Almighty. They had not restored the covenant that had once made them the light of the world. In the midst of this spiritual poverty, families struggled with questions that had no easy answers. How do you worship a God whose temple lies in ruins? How do you follow laws you can barely remember? How do you maintain your identity as God's people when everyone around you worships different gods, follows different customs, speaks different languages? Some had given up entirely, assimilating into the pagan cultures around them. Others clung desperately to fragments of memory, trying to piece together a faith from half-remembered stories and dimly understood traditions. Still others waited, praying that somehow, some way, God would remember His promises and send them the help they so desperately needed. The economic situation was as bleak as the spiritual one. The land that had once flowed with milk and honey now yielded barely enough to sustain life. The trade routes that had once brought prosperity to Jerusalem were controlled by hostile neighbors. The craftsmen and merchants who had once made Israel wealthy were scattered across the Persian Empire, many choosing to remain in Babylon, where life was more comfortable and opportunities more plentiful. Those who had returned found themselves at the mercy of local governors who cared nothing for their history or their God. Taxes were high, justice was scarce, and the future looked uncertain. Young people saw no reason to stay in this struggling land when the great cities of the empire offered education, careers, and comfort. The population was aging, diminishing, losing hope with each passing year. Yet in this darkness there were still those who remembered.